The first thing I noticed was not the concrete. It was the tire mark cutting through Helen's boxwoods. I stood at my kitchen window before sunrise, holding a cup of coffee I had not yet tasted, staring at the back corner of my yard where the ground had been torn open overnight. The grass was ripped into dark strips, my stone path was cracked near the old maple tree. A wet rectangle of concrete sat where there had been soil the evening before. But my eyes kept going back to those crushed shrubs. Helen had planted them herself the year before she got sick. There were 9 of them, set in a careful curve along the edge of the rear yard. She had measured the spacing with a garden trowel and a piece of twine because she knew I would try to make it too perfect. She had laughed at me for standing behind her with a level, and I had laughed back because she was right. Those boxwoods were small when she planted them. By the time I retired and moved fully into the rhythm of the house, they had grown into a low green border between the open lawn and the rougher corner near the drainage ditch. Now 3 of them were flattened into the mud. A set of dual tires had gone straight across them, pushed through the mulch, and stopped near the fresh concrete forms. For a few seconds, I simply stood there. I was 58 years old, a retired civil engineer, and I had spent most of my adult life solving problems that started with somebody insisting the line was somewhere it was not. Roads, drainage easements, culverts, setbacks, utility runs, subdivision plans. I had seen small errors become expensive disasters because someone had decided a measurement was inconvenient. Still, nothing in my career prepared me for the feeling of seeing that same carelessness in my own yard, on a quiet morning, in the place where my wife had left something living behind. My neighbor, Brad Whitmore, was building a garage. Not beside my land. On it. Brad lived in the oversized brick house to my right, the one with the black iron gate and the driveway lights that stayed on all night. He had moved in after me and quickly became the kind of man everyone knew without really knowing. He liked big trucks, loud weekend parties, and projects that required crews. He spoke to neighbors as if every conversation were a transaction he had already won. I had never gone looking for trouble with him. I kept my yard neat. I paid my dues. I attended the occasional HOA meeting and left early whenever the discussion turned into arguments about mailbox colors. After Helen died, I wanted a smaller life. Coffee on the porch, a repaired workshop, a vegetable bed, quiet evenings. I had bought the house because the rear yard felt private, with the old maple tree, the boxwoods, and enough space for me to breathe. That morning, a construction crew was walking through it. I put on my boots and went outside. The air smelled of diesel and wet concrete. A pickup truck idled near Brad's side yard. 2 workers were lifting boards beside the foundation. A skid steer sat near the torn grass with clumps of my soil still stuck in its tires. No one looked surprised to see me. That bothered me almost as much as the damage. They moved with the easy rhythm of people who had been told the problem had already been handled. I stopped several feet from the work area and asked who had authorized the concrete to be poured across my property line. The foreman gave me the kind of glance contractors give homeowners they have been warned about. He said the work had been approved. He said the boundary had been confirmed through the homeowners association. He pointed toward the back corner and indicated that the area was considered a common buffer. The words landed wrong immediately. There was no common buffer behind my house. I knew that because I had read the deed before closing. I had ordered my own survey. I had walked the line with the surveyor. The rear corner where Brad's concrete now sat was part of my lot. The drainage easement was farther back and narrower than people assumed. It did not belong to the HOA, and it certainly did not allow a private garage foundation. Before I could say more, Brad appeared from his side yard. He looked freshly showered and pleased with himself, as if he had come out to admire progress. He walked along the edge of the concrete forms without stepping into the mud, then faced me with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. He did not apologize. He did not ask what I believed had happened. He explained, with practiced calm, that the garage had been approved, that the HOA map showed the land as a buffer strip, and that any disagreement I had should be taken up with the board. I told him the concrete was on my side of the recorded boundary. He told me I was mistaken. I told him I had a survey. He told me surveys could be old, misunderstood, or superseded by community documents. That was when I understood the problem was not going to be solved in the yard. I went back inside. Brad stayed outside, watching me go. I could feel it even without turning around. He expected anger. He expected shouting. He expected me to make myself look unreasonable in front of the crew. I gave him none of that. I shut the back door, placed my cold coffee in the sink, and went straight to the office. The deed and survey were in the lower drawer of the metal filing cabinet. I took them out once, not to obsess over them, but to confirm what I already knew. The boundary was clear. The rear side yard extended well beyond the point where Brad's crew had poured concrete. The boxwoods, the stone path, and the work area were all inside my property. I laid the documents flat on the desk, photographed them, and then opened my security camera system. I had installed the cameras after Helen died. The house had felt too quiet at night, and the cameras gave me a small sense of order. The rear camera was mounted under the eave, angled down across my yard. It recorded the lawn, the maple tree, the boxwoods, the workshop door, and the boundary area near the drainage ditch. It did not point into Brad's windows. It did not look over his patio. It watched the land I owned. The footage began in darkness. At 5:08 a.m., headlights moved behind Brad's house. At 5:13, Brad walked into frame with two men. One wore a contractor's vest. The other wore a dark polo shirt with the HOA logo on the chest. They crossed directly into my yard. The man in the polo looked toward my house twice. Brad bent near the old survey stake. The contractor held a flashlight. Brad pulled the stake from the ground with both hands, twisted it loose, and carried it toward the brush near the ditch. A few minutes later, the contractor sprayed a new orange line several feet inside my yard. Then the skid steer came through. It rolled across the grass, turned wide, and crushed the first two boxwoods. The third bent under the tire and snapped back halfway, broken but still rooted. I watched that part more times than I should have, not because the video was unclear, but because I kept hoping I had misread it. The machine paused with one tire resting against the little curve of shrubs Helen had planted, then continued toward the work area. By 6 a.m., the forms were in place. By 7 a.m., the concrete truck arrived. I saved the file. I saved a second copy. I emailed it to myself. I exported still frames with the timestamp visible. Then I began a folder on my computer and named it Whitmore Encroachment. The first HOA email arrived before lunch. It came from Linda Carver, the president of the Homeowners Association. Linda had a talent for making threats sound like administrative reminders. Her message said Brad's detached garage had been reviewed and approved by the architectural committee. It said the project was located within an approved construction area according to HOA community records. It warned me not to harass workers, obstruct approved improvements, or enter the construction zone. The construction zone included my lawn. I did not answer immediately. I spent the afternoon documenting. I photographed the concrete, the tire tracks, the broken stone path, the snapped sprinkler head, the damaged shrubs, the missing stake location, and the equipment marks. I wrote down every truck number I could see. I made a simple timeline from the security footage. I kept my notes plain and factual, the way I had written field reports for decades. The second notice came the next morning. This one accused me of hostile conduct for recording the construction. It said my rear camera violated Brad's privacy and had to be removed or redirected within 48 hours. It included a $500 fine. I walked outside and looked up at the camera attached to my own roof, aimed at my own yard. The lens was still, black and quiet. Below it, the crushed boxwood sat in the mud. That camera had already caught the truth. I sent Linda one short written response. I stated that the camera was on my property and recorded my property. I asked for the architectural approval file, the site plan, the HOA map being relied upon, and any recorded document giving Brad or the HOA the right to build or enter across my lot. She did not send the full file. Instead, the management company sent a violation letter by certified mail. It accused me of placing unauthorized survey markers in a common area, interfering with a neighbor's approved improvement, and creating disharmony in the community. The fine increased. Daily penalties were threatened. The letter also mentioned the possibility of a lien if fines remained unpaid. Brad seemed to take the letters as permission. His crew returned the next day. They stacked lumber near my workshop. A delivery truck backed across the lawn and deepened the ruts near the boxwoods. One worker dragged a bundle of forms over the cracked stones Helen and I had set by hand. I watched from the porch long enough to record it, then went inside and called the county building department. I gave Brad's address and asked whether a detached garage permit had been issued. The clerk checked the property record. She found an old roofing permit, a fence permit from a prior owner, and a closed electrical permit. Nothing for a detached garage. She searched under the contractor's name. Still nothing. When she confirmed that no permit had been approved for Brad's garage, I asked for written confirmation and instructions for a public records request. That was the moment the case changed shape. Until then, Brad and Linda had been hiding behind the HOA. The county record showed there was a larger problem. Later that afternoon, Linda finally sent a map. It was a scanned PDF with the HOA logo at the top and a thick red boundary line drawn near the rear of my property. According to that map, Brad's garage sat partly in a common maintenance buffer, but the map looked wrong at a glance. The parcel numbers were blurred, the scale information was missing, the drainage easement had been broadened and shifted. The rear lot line did not match the recorded subdivision plat I had in my file. I did not spend days comparing maps over and over. I did one careful check. I used the county plat, Linda's scan, and the measurements from my survey. The HOA version did not align. It moved my boundary inward by roughly 18 feet and turned a limited drainage easement into a strip of land the HOA claimed it could control. I printed both maps, marked the mismatches, and drove to the county recorder's office the next morning. There, I obtained certified copies of my deed, Brad's deed, the subdivision plat, the recorded easements, and the covenants. I wanted county seals, receipt numbers, and paper that could not be dismissed as something I had adjusted on a computer. The records confirmed the same thing my original survey showed. There was no common buffer behind my house. There was no maintenance strip. There was no easement that allowed a private garage. The HOA map had no legal authority over the recorded boundary. I hired a licensed surveyor named Mark Ellis. Mark came out 2 days later with his crew. Brad appeared almost immediately. He stood near the work area, phone in hand, taking pictures and making visible complaints. Linda arrived 20 minutes after that. She carried a folder and watched from Brad's driveway. I stayed on my porch and let the professionals work. Mark's crew located the front pins, the rear reference points, and the drainage easement. They marked the true boundary with fresh stakes and flags. The line ran exactly where I had known it would. Brad's foundation crossed onto my property by a little more than 16 feet at the widest point. Then one of Mark's assistants found the old stakes in the brush. Both had been pulled up and tossed near the ditch. One still had the orange flagging attached. Mark photographed them where they lay before touching them. He included the finding in his report. I sent the survey report to Linda, Brad, the management company, and the contractor. The message was formal. The construction encroached on my land. Work had to stop. All communications, approvals, maps, and construction documents had to be preserved. Linda responded with a $3,000 fine. She called the new survey stakes an unauthorized visual nuisance. She repeated that the area was common property according to HOA records. She warned again that unpaid fines could lead to collection action and a lien. That evening, Brad came to my front door. I did not open it. My porch camera recorded him standing there with one hand braced on the door frame, his expression tight, his gestures sharp. Through the glass, he made it clear he believed I was making an expensive mistake. He believed court would cost more than the land was worth. He believed retired people should be careful before starting fights with neighbors who had better resources. I saved that footage too. The next morning, the crew returned and started framing the garage. That was the decision that hurt them most. By then, everyone had the survey, everyone had notice, everyone knew the boundary was disputed. Yet the workers lifted lumber onto the concrete and began raising walls as if speed could turn a wrong act into a finished fact. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and requested a trespass report. I also called the county building department again and told them unpermitted work was continuing after a boundary dispute and after the display of a questionable approval. The deputy arrived first. Brad came outside with Linda beside him. The foreman hovered near the framed wall. Several neighbors slowed their walks or stood near mailboxes. The deputy listened while Linda presented her folder and Brad gestured toward the HOA map. I waited until they were finished. Then I handed over certified copies of the plat and deed, Mark's survey, photographs of the pulled stakes, and still frames from the rear camera. When the deputy saw the image of Brad removing the marker before sunrise, the whole mood shifted. No one was arrested. I had not expected that, but the deputy took a report, He documented the encroachment claim, the survey, the removed markers, the continuing work, and the video evidence. He warned Brad and the contractor that continuing after notice could create bigger legal problems. Then the county inspector arrived. He walked directly to the job site and asked for the permit. The contractor pointed to a laminated sheet taped to a post near Brad's driveway. The inspector studied it, checked his tablet, and removed the paper from the post. The number belonged to a different project at a different address. The inspector placed a stop work order on the garage. The bright notice went up on the raw frame in front of everyone. Brad's face changed first. The confidence drained out of it, leaving something harder and smaller behind. Linda tried to stay composed, but she closed her folder and held it against her chest like a shield. The contractor stepped away and made a phone call with his back turned. For the first time since the concrete appeared, the crew packed up and left. The yard went quiet that evening. The frame stood there unfinished. The stop work order snapped lightly in the wind. The crushed boxwoods had started to brown at the edges. I sat on the back porch until dark. I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about Helen kneeling in the mulch with soil on her gloves, telling me the shrubs would make the corner feel less bare. I had not realized until that week how much of her remained in small decisions around the house. A plant here, a stone there, a curve in the border because straight lines made everything look too rigid. Brad had looked at that same corner and seen unused space. That difference mattered. The HOA board called an emergency meeting the following week. I was not invited, but the results arrived quickly. Another certified letter came. The fines had climbed. The HOA declared that my refusal to cooperate had caused unnecessary conflict and legal review costs. They threatened a lien on my home. That was when I hired Rachel Kim. Rachel handled property disputes and HOA litigation. In our first meeting, she did not ask how angry I was. She asked for dates. She asked for original video files. She asked for the surveyor's report, county records, HOA notices, photographs, and the permit information. She built a timeline across a yellow legal pad, and by the end of the meeting, the entire situation looked less like a neighbor disagreement and more like a coordinated attempt to force an illegal encroachment through before I could stop it. Rachel sent demand letters to Brad, Linda, the HOA, the management company, and the contractor. She required them to stop all work, remove the encroachment, restore my property, withdraw the fines, abandon the lien threat, preserve all documents, and compensate me for damage, survey expenses, and legal fees. The preservation demand produced the next break. A woman named Megan Porter contacted Rachel 2 days later. Megan had been the HOA secretary until a few months earlier. She had resigned after repeated disputes with Linda over records and approvals. She agreed to meet at Rachel's office and brought copies of emails, meeting notes, and draft documents she had kept because she feared being blamed later. Megan explained that Brad's original garage plan did not fit within his buildable area. The structure he wanted was too large. If he respected the actual boundary and setback requirements, he would have to shrink it or move it. He did not want to do either. Linda had tried to solve that problem by treating the rear strip as HOA-controlled space. Megan had objected because the recorded plat did not support it. She had refused to edit a boundary map. Later, she saw a revised version in the architectural file. That version shifted my line inward and labeled the strip as a common maintenance buffer. The emails were worse than the map. One message from Linda acknowledged that county records could create issues if I challenged the approval. Another message from Brad said I probably would not spend money fighting over a strip of grass. A note from a private meeting referred to using the HOA map for approval and dealing with county questions only if they came up. There was also a message about moving old markers before the crew arrived, so there would be no confusion on site. They had created the confusion and then tried to use it against me. Rachel filed suit. The complaint asked for an injunction, removal of the encroachment, damages for trespass, invalidation of the HOA fines, relief from the lien threat, and recovery of costs. It also raised the issue of the altered map, the unpermitted work, and the false permit display. The temporary injunction hearing came first. Brad arrived in a suit. Linda arrived with the HOA attorney. The contractor had separate counsel. I sat beside Rachel with a binder in front of me. I had spent my career around technical disputes, but this felt different. A courtroom has its own kind of silence. Every page sounds louder, every pause feels longer. Rachel did not try to make the judge dislike anyone. She built the case with sequence. The deed came first, then the recorded plat, then Mark's survey, then the photographs of the concrete and framing, then the stop work order, then the HOA fines, then the still frames from the camera showing Brad removing the stake. The judge granted the temporary injunction. Brad could not continue work. The HOA could not collect or increase fines tied to my efforts to document and dispute the construction. The lien threat had to stop while the case moved forward. That order gave me space to breathe, but it did not restore the yard. The half-built garage still stood there, wrapped in tarps, looming over the boxwoods like a mistake refusing to leave. Discovery made the mistake uglier. Rachel obtained contractor texts showing that the original garage plan had been smaller and properly placed. Brad had rejected it. A later plan shifted the building toward my property. In one text, the contractor warned that the placement could cross the line and violate setbacks. Brad answered that the HOA would cover the boundary issue. In another, Linda sent the revised map and instructed the contractor to use that version for the architectural file. The contractor's attorney eventually produced the job paperwork. The permit sheet on site was not a valid permit for Brad's garage. It had been copied from a different address. The contractor claimed it was an office error. The county did not treat it lightly. By the time the full hearing arrived, the neighborhood had changed around the case. People who had avoided me began stopping near the mailbox. Some asked careful questions. Some admitted they had paid fines they did not understand because Linda made challenging them seem impossible. One older couple told me the HOA had once ordered them to remove a ramp after surgery, then approved a nearly identical ramp for a board member. The fear in the neighborhood had not disappeared, but it had started to crack. The final hearing lasted longer than I expected. Mark testified about the boundary. The county inspector testified about the stop work order and the invalid permit display. Megan testified about the HOA records and the altered map. I testified about the morning I found the concrete, the camera footage, the damage, the notices, and the continued work after the survey was sent. I kept my answers factual. When Rachel played the security footage, the courtroom became very still. The video showed Brad entering my yard before dawn. It showed the contractor with the flashlight. It showed the HOA representative standing nearby. It showed Brad pulling out the survey stake and carrying it to the brush. It showed the orange paint going down in a false location. Then it showed the skid steer crossing the lawn and rolling through Helen's boxwoods. That last part hit harder in the courtroom than I expected. Until then, the shrubs had been part of the damages list. Landscaping, replacement cost, photographs. But on the screen, they were not line items. They were living things being crushed under a machine brought onto land no one had the right to enter. I looked down when the tire rolled over them. Rachel paused the video on the frame where the machine rested halfway across the little curve of green. She let the image sit. Brad's attorney tried to frame the issue as confusion. Rachel answered with the survey, the emails, and the removed markers. Linda's attorney argued the board had relied on community documents in good faith. Rachel answered with the county plat, Megan's testimony, and Linda's own message acknowledging the county records problem. The contractor tried to separate himself from the boundary decision. Rachel used his text warning Brad about the line. The judge did not need drama. The documents and video carried the weight. The ruling came in stages, but the main points were clear. Brad had trespassed and encroached on my property. The encroachment had to be removed. My land had to be restored. Brad was responsible for the damage to the yard, drainage, stone path, and landscaping, including the boxwoods. The HOA fines were invalid. The lien threat had to be withdrawn. The HOA had exceeded its authority by relying on an inaccurate, unrecorded map against recorded county documents. The board had to correct its records and notify homeowners that the map used in Brad's approval was not a legal boundary document. The fee award came later, and it was substantial. Brad and the HOA had to cover a large portion of my legal expenses because they continued after receiving notice and used fines to pressure me during a property dispute. But the most satisfying consequences came after the ruling. The county opened an investigation into the permit issue. The contractor's license was placed under review, and his company disappeared from neighborhood job sites almost immediately. His insurance carrier became involved in the property damage claim. Brad tried to distance himself from the permit problem, but the text messages made that difficult. The HOA membership meeting happened 2 weeks after the court order. I attended for the first time in months. Linda sat at the front table with a tight face and a stack of papers she never managed to control. Residents filled every chair and lined the back wall. Megan stood up and described how records had been handled, how objections were ignored, and how the map in my case had been used despite warnings. Another homeowner asked how many other architectural approvals relied on informal maps. Someone else asked whether fines had been issued under rules the board had misrepresented. Linda tried to move through the agenda. The room would not let her. One resident held up a copy of the court order. Another demanded a financial audit. A third asked whether the board's insurance would cover misconduct if documents had been knowingly altered. The management company representative stopped taking notes and started looking at the exit. Linda did not resign gracefully. She tried to read a statement blaming confusion, outdated records, and my unwillingness to cooperate. Halfway through, a man from the back asked why cooperation required me to give up 16 feet of my yard. Someone else asked why a homeowner had to go to court to make the HOA read a deed. The room, which Linda had controlled for years with procedure and warnings, no longer obeyed her. By the end of the meeting, enough residents had signed the petition to remove her. She resigned before the vote could finish. Brad's fall was quieter but more visible. The court gave him a deadline to remove the encroaching foundation and framing. He delayed once, then Rachel filed for enforcement. The judge ordered compliance and added daily penalties if the work was not completed. That got his attention. The demolition crew arrived on a cold morning. This time, everything was formal. Temporary access was arranged through my attorney. Protective mats were placed exactly where the crew was allowed to cross. Mark came to verify the boundary before the work began. The county inspector stopped by. Brad stood in his driveway with his arms folded, watching the garage he had tried to force onto my land come apart piece by piece. The whole neighborhood heard it. The saws cut through the frame first. Then the lumber came down. Then the concrete breaker started. The sound carried down the street for hours, sharp and final. Chunks of the foundation were lifted away from my side of the line and loaded into a dump truck. Dust rose over the yard. The stop work order, faded by then, was removed with the last section of framing. I watched from the porch. I did not feel sorry for Brad. I did not feel the joy I had imagined either. What I felt was steadier. The thing that should never have been there was leaving. The corner of the yard was becoming visible again. The maple tree, the torn grass, the broken stones, the wounded shrubs, all of it looked exposed but no longer trapped under someone else's decision. When the concrete was gone, the restoration began. Brad had to pay for grading, drainage repair, new soil, replacement stonework, reseeding, and landscaping. The original boxwoods could not all be saved. 3 were dead. 2 were badly damaged. I asked the landscaper to leave the healthiest 4 in place and plant new ones between them. I wanted the row to show time, not replacement. New growth beside old growth, loss beside repair. The HOA sent a public apology as part of the final resolution. It was read at the next membership meeting by the interim president, not Linda. It acknowledged that the fines against me had been improper, that homeowners had the right to rely on recorded deeds and lawful surveys, and that the map used to approve Brad's project had no legal authority. The board voted to commission an outside audit of architectural approvals and fine procedures. A refund check arrived for the fines they had tried to collect, even though I had never paid them. Rachel said it was part of cleaning the record. I kept a copy of the check stub in my file. Brad listed his house in the spring. The listing photos avoided the side yard completely. He moved out before summer. On his last weekend, I saw him loading boxes into the same black truck that had once blocked half the street. He did not look at my house. He did not look at the restored boundary. He just kept moving, carrying one box after another from the garage he still had, not the one he had tried to take land for. Linda left the neighborhood not long after. Her house did not sell as quickly. For weeks, people drove slowly past it, the way they drive past a place where something embarrassing happened. No one shouted at her. No one needed to. Her authority had depended on people believing she could not be challenged. Once that belief was gone, she was just a woman with a stack of bad letters and a court order attached to her name. The new owners of Brad's house came by with a plate of cookies and a folder of their own. They asked where the exact line was before planning a fence. I showed them the survey. They thanked me, hired their own contractor, pulled the proper permit, and placed the fence 2 inches inside their side. That was all Brad ever had to do. Ask. Verify. Respect the line. I rebuilt the back corner slowly. I repaired the workshop door that had been splattered with mud. I replaced the cracked stones one at a time. I reseeded the torn grass and watered it every morning. The new boxwoods looked too small at first, almost awkward beside the older ones, but by the end of the season they had taken root. One evening, I stood near them with the hose in my hand and realized I was no longer looking at the corner as the place Brad had damaged. I was looking at it as Helen's border again. That mattered more than the money. People sometimes ask why I did not yell more, why I did not confront Brad harder, why I did not make a scene when I first saw the concrete. The truth is, I was angry from the beginning. I was angry when I saw the tire marks. I was angry when Linda fined me for recording my own yard. I was angry when Brad stood on my porch and tried to scare me with legal costs. I was angry when the video showed his machine crushing the shrubs my wife had planted. I just refused to spend that anger where it would help them. I spent it on records. I spent it on certified copies, saved emails, camera backups, photographs, survey stakes, public records requests, and a lawyer who knew how to turn a timeline into a case. Brad and Linda expected noise. They expected exhaustion. They expected me to decide 16 feet of land was not worth the trouble. They never understood what they had stepped on. It was not just grass. It was my deed. It was my home. It was my wife's boxwoods. It was the quiet life I had worked for, and the boundary that separated ownership from permission. Now, when I sit on the back porch in the morning, the yard looks almost ordinary again. The grass has filled in. The maple throws shade across the repaired stones. The camera still watches from the eave, silent and patient. The boxwoods are uneven, but alive. The line is marked correctly. The records are corrected. The garage is gone. And every time the sun comes up over that back corner, I am reminded that sometimes the strongest answer to people who think they can take what belongs to you is not shouting. It is proof.